In the final years of the Great War, little had changed except the death count had grown higher, the number of soldiers had grown smaller, and the great powers grew increasingly desperate to end the war. One of the great challenges of war is logistics. You need soldiers, weapons, ammunition, fuel, and food, and you need to bring it to where it needs to go to win the war. Seemingly simple inventions like roads, radios, rail yards, and even roadside signs had changed logistics. Although, even in 2710, there were great challenges in both having enough soldiers and having enough food to feed the soldiers that were there. While the scientists of the newly formed MSU worked on technological answers, quartermasters tried to solve the supply issues, and politicians tried to solve the home front issues. It was a new doctor from Europa who offered a means to solve the soldier shortage in a unique way. Doctor Frances Stern was born in Avenses, Helvetica, where her chemical weapons made her a wanted woman by Gotha Civitas in the Roman Republic, and the neophyte Mad Scientists Union were willing to turn her in to both the Central Cabal and the Great Powers. So she sought asylum with the Empire of the Seven Cities, and it was agreed she would be allowed sanctuary in the cities with her criminal record ignored in exchange for her creating new chemical weapons for the Empire of the Seven Cities. Process that is commonly called paperclipping, where a major criminal can escape the consequences of their crimes by agreeing to provide service to a country. It got the name paperclipping from how a paperclip would be used to cover up their previous crime section, other applications for citizenship, a process that continues to this day. It was in a hidden laboratory in Imperial City, simply called Facility 14, where Dr. Stern continued her work producing chemical weapons that would be deployed against the Kingdom of Vespucci on the riverfront. It was one unique chemical cocktail that Dr. Stern would offer as the means of changing warfare forever, and it was this cocktail that would give Dr. Stern her nickname, Dr. Foresight. Unknown date 2710. Facility 14 just received a new doctor from Helvetica, a scientist with a double PhD in both chemistry and biochemistry. She's not even 30 years old and already more educated than most of the doctors on staff, who think that rubbing alcohol is drinking alcohol, and who thinks that glue is breathable. But we are desperate for anyone with even a few functioning brain cells, ever since most of our scientists went on strike last year and never returned. It took longer than you would think to move all of her stuff into the office. She even had an entire truck just full of boxes of her notes. She also had to have her own Bent's coffee maker. The thing is older than I am, and I don't know what is wrong with the coffee maker in the break room. So I introduced myself to her. I was the head admin for Facility 14, so any request for funding and materials would have to go through me first. She didn't even finish moving everything into her office before she started putting the interns to work by sending material requests to me. The forms were filled out entirely, and the quantities and chemicals were more than a mystery to me. Some of the chemicals I recognized easily enough: sodium hydrochlorite, azane, sulfur mustard, isopropyl, argent vivum, and Anatolian coffee. I recognized the mustard agent, and the other agents could create nasty chemicals for our enemies. Even the coffee made sense. I did not know a single scientist whose blood wasn't at least 2 parts coffee. Other materials on the list did not make nearly as much sense to me, though. Cadmium, wolfram, lithium, devil's copper, plumbum, sucrose, glucagon, insulin, and even pitchblende. Not just any pitchblende, no, it had to be from a specific basin from the northern forest, and only that basin. No other pitchblende would do. She was very specific in her request form. The other ingredients were not nearly as specific. She didn't even specify if she meant sucrose like table sugar or if she meant the kind used in school labs. Even though I was mystified, I still approved her requests and moved on with my day, thinking that everything would get clearer as she was given time to produce us weapons. It didn't take long for us to get results, although I was not sure how, even as she explained it to me many times. The first gas she tested was on captured helots equipped in the very best gas masks we had, the kind that filtered out almost every other kind of gas we had. We had some specific concentrations that could corrode rubber and melt the gas masks, but those were incredibly expensive, and the Empress wanted something military grade, meaning cheap but able to do the job. Dr. Stern's gas concoction had a slight yellow tinge to it, despite the low concentration. When the gas dissipated, she sent in more helots also dressed in gas masks. It took an hour for everyone in that room to die. Even those that were brought in later died without being exposed to the gas. They were coughing and their hair was falling out, and before they started complaining of stomach pain, and they started throwing up blood and black bile. Burns formed on their skins, even underneath their uniforms. When the last one died, drowning in their own vomit and blood, Dr. Stern explained that in 3 hours it would be safe to go inside. The gas could be fired from an artillery shell, and the gas could contaminate the battlefield or even a town or city from kilometers away. Anyone exposed to the gas, even if they didn't breathe it in, would be exposed to a lethal energy that would fade after 4 hours. Anyone who got close to anyone exposed would also die quickly or get greatly ill. This would allow entire trenches and towns to be cleared of any enemy soldiers without touching the equipment and the infrastructure. Even if the exposed soldiers retreated, anyone or anything they touched would be contaminated and would also die. As long as our soldiers waited at least 4 hours, they would be safe from the energy, something that Dr. Stern called radiation. Apparently, that was why both the Central Cabal and the Great Powers wanted to imprison Dr. Stern. She had made this gas, and she sold it to both Gothia Civitas and the Roman Republic, and when they both fired it at each other, 57,000 casualties in just 4 hours, and the Helvetica front was completely untouched. Needless to say, no one was happy, but the Empress saw opportunity in that crisis. The results from the gas that Dr. Stern had called Foresight 1 had made their way up the military high command, including the Empress, and with her shared methods on how to make the gas and deliver it safely, shared with factories across the 7 cities, so we can now begin to end the stalemate on the Great Riverfront. Unknown date 2711 AUC. Despite the initial successful deployments of Foresight 1, we did not move as far forward as the Empress would have wished. Some parts of the Great River are 17 kilometers apart, and our artillery can barely fire past it. So by the time our forces get to the other side, the soldiers aren't as dead as we wished. We also found out the hard way that, like other gases, a sudden change in the breeze can have the gas blowing towards us instead of towards the enemy. Also, an unexpected side effect not even Dr. Foresight could tell us about. The gas could settle in the water, and when it does, it is dangerous for a lot longer than 4 hours. Whatever that radiation is contaminates even clean-looking water for 4 weeks after the gas is long gone. And a side effect we should have seen coming? Chemical weapons don't affect landmines and traps set by the Kingdom of Vespucci. So even if a trench is cleared of enemy soldiers, the landmines in front of it would deter any quick advance. Still, we could have worked with this, we could have learned, we could have adapted, and we could have pushed Vespucci forces all the way back to their capital of misery and kept pushing. Except it turns out they adapted a lot quicker than we could have expected. Just when we started to push the kingdom past the river, they stopped dying to Foresight 1 in such numbers. Sure, there were still a few dead, but most of them were safe from the gas and still fighting against it. We examined the bodies of dead soldiers to find out they were using adapted firefighter uniforms, the kind that used self-containing breathing apparatuses or SCEBA and had layers to it meant for resisting fire that also worked nearly as well against that strange energy in Foresight 1. And that was what the soldiers were wearing. The kingdom also adapted by building bunkers underground with their own air supply and water supply that soldiers could rest in, protected from the gas. And shelters were built in towns that were made to keep the population safe until the gas finally dissipated. And of course, the gas doesn't stop the landmines, river mines, and other traps left to stop the advance. They got very clever with their traps, setting up spiked pits, trenches full of landmines, and even electrical hazards that would electrify a moat for weeks after the soldiers had left. The tactics changed to keep the war going, and just a few landmines had the capability of halting our massive advances, no matter how much foresight we used. My bosses came down hard on me, the same bosses who just a month ago were praising Foresight 1, and now they are pushing me to push Dr. Stern even further. When she was told she would need to keep making weapons, she muttered about the upper command. Every time they tell me to build them a weapon that can end a war in a single use, but no one is smart enough to use it right. There's no such thing as a wonder weapon, she said as she went back to her lab to drink more coffee and sketch out more chemistry symbols on her chalkboard. I didn't say anything because I know that people from Europa had a hard time with discipline. In time, she would learn, and it wouldn't be me who would be teaching her. It took her another 6 months before she introduced Foresight 2, a sour gas that used traces of hydrogen sulfide, carbon dioxide, and even sodium, all in a solid form meant to be fired at an enemy's water supply, or fired and left to be rained on. The sodium would explode when exposed to water, and then the explosion would fling the other materials even further, where once it was exposed to water, it would release an acidic gas. A gas that would corrode sensitive pipes, damage radio and telegraph lines, and affect the infrastructure of the Kingdom of Vespucci with little effect on the people. Anyone exposed would get some boils on their skin and their lungs would be damaged, but no permanent harm if they escaped quickly and got help. On land, Foresight 2 had some positive effects on the war effort by disrupting the kingdom's infrastructure. At sea, on the other hand, it turns out the plentiful seawater turned Foresight 2 from a mild threat into something that could sink fleets in minutes. A single ship sank the entire First Oceanus fleet in the Battle of Outpost 13. The single ship, with support from the outpost, managed to sink 3 ships, and the other 9 were permanently disabled due to exposure to Foresight 2. Adding it to the sea mines and as ammunition to the Imperial ships, turned the war at sea into the Empire's favor. Only at sea, though. On land, however, Foresight 2 only served to mess with infrastructure, and it didn't end the war by itself like the Empress wanted. The kingdom also adapted. Water sources were covered as much as they could be, and any bombs that fell would be covered with tarps as quickly as they could to keep Foresight 2 from being released. And that was before all of the accidents. A small leak in a munition factory led to Foresight 2 being released as a gas before it was compounded with sodium, so the entire factory corroded overnight and was made inoperable. While it was full of bullets, lead, gunpowder, and explosives, the materials were hundreds of millions of centi worth of material that was made unusable to the war effort, and the loss of the factory itself. Needless to say, my bosses were even less happy this time around. It took her longer to create a brand new weapon, and this one was even less effective. Sure, we were no longer losing in the Oceanus front, but the Great River front was the same as it was before, a stagnant line of poisoned trenches stretching from the northern forest to the Tano Sea. A place where people went to die, but neither side could gain any territory or purchase over the other. Sure, we were hurting the kingdom worse than they were hurting us. That wouldn't matter if they kept standing. Exhaustion and war fatigue is what the papers called it, but my boss just called it defeatism. The Empress no longer sent checks for lives lost. Every death would have a simple letter with a name filled in by a secretary and signed by a secretary as an acknowledgement of death. We are sorry for your loss, but insert deceased dead name here. Died at, insert location and date. Your deceased died a hero for the Empire and Empress. We will honor their sacrifice forever. Signed, Secretary's signature here. Except a lot of those names are misspelled, if they are put in the letter at all. It wasn't uncommon for a single household to get letters for everyone sent to the front, and not have a single letter have a name in it, and every space meant to be filled in was left blank. If there was even anyone left for the letter to go to. Entire neighborhoods with no one left to bury the dead, empty houses receiving blank letters announcing a death with no name to a non-existent family. Needless to say, it was not popular. People needed something to hope for, and the Empress thought a wonder weapon would change all of that. So, Dr. Stern was put back to work on Foresight 3. A full year worth of work, my bosses practically breathing down my neck, and I received news of riots in all of the 7 cities. Even when the Empress stamped them out, the Great War was not popular. No major changes in the Great River front, and no other weapons being introduced that were changing the war effort. Sure, there were new bullets, new guns, new manufacturing methods to save materials, but no weapon to end the war. At least until the introduction of Foresight 3. The chemicals were far more esoteric than I have ever seen. Compounds with letters and numbers that made my head hurt just to read them over. And a sample of Baron Bacillus, which was extremely difficult to get my hands on. Still, the requests were made, and the chemicals were brought in, and Dr. Foresight worked on her newest concoction. It took a long time, but when we saw the gas, it scared me. There was a body in the sealed room behind the glass. The body was a former soldier that had half of the face torn off. Maggots were in the socket as Dr. Stern showed us all how Foresight 3 worked. The gas filled the room, and when it touched the body twitched, and I gasped as I saw it breathe. The fingers twitched as the body awkwardly stood up. Hunger, anger, angerer, protein, produce, prate, pray, pray. The corpse said as it reached into its own eye socket as it chewed on the maggots. The rotten, broken teeth chewed on it as the flesh in the socket began to heal slowly. What is that? I asked Dr. Foresight as she smirked and she explained. This is how you end the war. Turning the dead into your own soldiers. Faster than sufferers, they eat flesh and bone to heal themselves, and they are repulsed by a signal that can be used to push them forward. They have advanced adaptation, and the gas only affects dead human cells, Dr. Foresight said as the colonel asked. So you've created faster sufferers. We've already tried weaponizing sufferers. They don't take orders, and everyone knows to shoot them in the head, the colonel said as Dr. Foresight opened the door to the room, and after going through the airlock, she fired a bullet directly into the dead man's skull, which stilled the dead man's movements. She left the airlock and joined us. Just keep watching, she said, and it did not take long for us to see what she was trying to show us. The body began to move again, and it continued to eat the maggots from its skull. We watched as bone and tissue began to knit together in the bullet hole. More adaptive than SAMD sufferers, and like I said, we can repulse them with specific sound signals. The gas only affects dead human cells, and we can turn entire fields of the dead into weapons. You wanted a weapon powerful enough to end the war? I give you an Eigenweapon. Foresight 3, Dr. Foresight said as the military eagerly agreed to test her weapon. Unknown date 2713 AUC. They would test Foresight 3 just outside of Crossroads. Crossroads was the terminus of a massive network of rails, roads, and even boats. 80% of all traffic in the eastern half of the Kingdom of Vespucci went through Crossroads, in some way, shape, or form. It was 40 kilometers west of the Great River, and it was guarded by 2 different forts, and the wind was always blowing west to east, keeping us from using gas against the city, and sour gas couldn't get close enough to damage the infrastructure. It was also one of the longest running battles in the history of the continent. The dead were so plentiful in no man's land that no one could go in to even bring the bodies home. Even the rats and the roaches were killed too often to break down the bodies. In some places, the bodies were so high they were 3 people deep. A perfect place to test Foresight 3. It was fired west of no man's land so the gas could spread and bring back all of the corpses. Gas moved slowly, with a slight lavender tint to it, moving slowly like a plague of fog that wormed and slithered throughout the battlefield, leaving behind thin trails that tethered to the deceased. We didn't know how long the bodies had to be exposed before it was impossible to bring them back. The first thing we heard was the screams from the crossroads, and then the screams got closer. The screams were so plentiful that it could be heard over the artillery. We watched as the corpses rose, and those who could still move and stand stood and made their way to Crossroads. Those that couldn't move fed those that could move. They healed from the damage of death as they made their way forward to Crossroads. The walls of the city held them out, for a while at least. They were fired upon and the bullets slowed them down, but those that stopped moving fed the rest as they healed and they mutated. The forts were the first to fall, although I don't know how. I didn't see any of the dead get in there. All I know is I heard the screams get worse, and the bullets stopped flying from the forts, and in time there were no more screams. The dead that ate well, fully healed, looking like normal people, except they kept changing as the biomass was converted into fuel. Their fingers grew long as the bones underneath became larger, and the flesh healed slowly over, where the bones broke through, making them misshapen and better adapted. The dead, with their new claws, climbed over the walls, and they got faster and fiercer. Nothing the kingdom threw at the dead stopped them for long. Even when the bullets cut them in half, they would consume their fallen legs and crawl forward, regenerating their lost limbs. Even if bodies were obliterated by explosives, their pieces fed those that survived as they kept pushing forward, adapting and growing harder to slow down. The only thing that seemed like it had any real impact was napalm. It burned both flesh and bone, and there wasn't enough left for them to return or even consume. But the Crossroads was never prepared to use fire to defend themselves, so they didn't have nearly enough napalm to fight off the attack. They did, however, have one last trick up their sleeve. They launched canisters of sulfur mustard against us, and the soldiers barely had time to put on their gas masks. It protected us, but we were worried about the dead. At first, though. Although the sulfur mustard didn't even slow them down. The screams got louder from Crossroads all day. Long before the sun set, no more guns were fired from the walls, and when dawn came back the next day, there were no more screams. The soldiers sent in to clear Crossroads, they never came back. Even armored divisions sent into Crossroads didn't survive long enough to even say what was happening inside the city. We had to set up patrols and fences to contain the dead inside of Crossroads. The few who wandered out into our patrols were very different from the ones who once were sent into the city. There was the starved, and there was the apex. The starved were nearly skeletal, no food, had most of their fat and muscle burned away, with their bones barely covered, as they shambled towards us. These were easy to kill. They didn't regenerate like everything else, but we still burned them. They were easy to kill, if not disturbing. They still spoke words, usually about how hungry they were, and there seemed to be an almost pattern to their words. Just enough that you felt like if you listened just a little while longer, you could understand them. That was haunting. To watch something you know should not live, and as it gets closer and closer, you can see it smile and reach out to you like your savior, but the words are never quite right. They're not quite words, just sounds made to sound like words. Habma, habma, oo, oo, yang, abu. Those words still haunt me to this day, and as disturbing as they were, at least they were easy to kill. They died and they stayed dead. Apexes are a different story. Well-fed monstrosities that were given a lot of chances to mutate and change into something monstrous. Lumbering giants that were at least 3 meters tall, with thick skin that could resist even machine gun fire. They had at least 6 eyes on their faces, and I had seen some with as many as 30. Their mouths migrated down to their stomachs, and they fed their stomachs with any meat they ran across. Their muscles were massive, and I have seen them push a tank, and they are almost impossible to kill. Even a 150 millimeter shell to the chest only slowed it down as the apex healed. Machine gun fire wasn't strong enough to make it bleed. Conventional explosives only did damage that was healed in seconds. Fire burned the skin, but didn't do any permanent damage. Gas didn't harm it, even if it was Foresight 1. The only thing we had that could repel it was the signal, and everything else was lucky to harm it, and that turned out to make the apex much worse. Just like scar tissue, any damaged flesh healed back stronger, tougher, and less likely to be hurt next time. If you got lucky enough to immolate an apex, it would start secreting a flame retardant gel that was better than anything we used by us. If you managed to get an incendiary round inside the brain would come back and the skull would resist impacts exceeding hundreds of tons per square centimeter. If a grenade got lucky enough to blow off a limb, the limb would grow back. And usually they would grow back extra limbs. A living nightmare, and one we could never kill. Even though taking down Crossroads essentially shut down the war effort on that part of the kingdom, since now their logistics were essentially tangled spaghetti now. However, the Empire now had to devote far many more troops to containing Crossroads, as Exclusion Zone Zero now. The war effort was once again a stalemate, with only rising casualties and no changes in the stalemate, but the knowledge that a single mess-up could doom us all. Dr. Foresight was asked to create something that could end the threat created by Foresight 3. He agreed, but only on the stipulation that she be released from custody, and that they wouldn't seek her out anymore. The agreement came from the Empress herself as Dr. Foresight created the gas, Hindsight 1. Dr. Foresight explained to us as we watched her create a sweetened version of to create Hindsight 1. Everyone thinks of adaptation and evolution like leveling up in a tabletop game. You just get stronger, you get tougher, you get harder to kill. Adaptation makes choices based on what is happening around, except there is no choice involved. Evolution doesn't care. Evolution doesn't choose. Evolution isn't leveling up. Well, evolution isn't even getting more advanced. It is changing to suit your environment through a mixture of random choices, mutations, changes, and available materials. The Apex aren't choosing to be tougher. They're adapting against threats that are presented against them. They burn, and the cells that survive the burning mutate into something else. If it doesn't succeed, then mutation dies off. If it thrives, however, it is kept and it is shared with other cells. Every apex is essentially a large disorganized group that does random things, and those random things are sometimes helpful to the group. And when it isn't helpful, those cells are rapidly killed off. So, how do you defeat something that adapts so quickly and so thoroughly? There are a few ways. Burning the body so the cells that remain don't have enough biomass to regenerate. Sufficiently high damage may disable the body to the point where it is torn apart by other Apex. However, I don't recommend that because the genetic adaptations are shared that way with anyone else affected by Foresight 3. So they eat a fallen comrade, they gain the fallen comrade's power. There is also radiation, however it would have to be a very large dose, much stronger than the radiation in Foresight 1. However, that would also leave Crossroads unapproachable for the next 100 years. So you don't stop the adaptation, you accelerate it. Mutation occurs in our cells every day. More often than not, those mutations either don't do anything, or it is maladaptive, usually creating cancer. These negative mutations occur far more often than positive mutations. Our immune system kills off these cancer cells before they can spread, at least most of the time. In the case of the apex, though, maladaptive mutations are killed off far too quick to slow them down, making cancer something that doesn't occur naturally. So if you accelerate the process for mutation quicker than their bodies can keep up, then you will create various forms of cancer that consume biomass and force the bodies into a state they cannot move, she said as she gave us canisters of Hindsight 1. She was released that day, and we test Hindsight 1 on Crossroads. By that point, the armistice was declared. The Kingdom of Vespucci and the Empire of the Seven Cities were no longer shooting, but there was no territory exchange, and the war wasn't formally over, so we fired several artillery shells of Hindsight 1 into the city. After a couple of days, we sent in armored divisions, and for the first time, they returned alive. Starved and apex alike were dead on the streets, tumor-filled and unmoving, their biomass spent on sustaining their tumors, and they were finally dead. So the bodies were gathered and burned, the ashes kept in special containers because we were warned by Dr. Foresight that even ashes will contain traces of Foresight 3 and Hindsight 1, which would have nasty effects on us all. So the ashes were stored in barrels that were then stored in a coal mine in Central Hill. The ashes were stored, and in time the armistice became an actual peace treaty, and we returned Crossroads to the Kingdom of Vespucci. Except something kept happening. People got cancer far more often than they were supposed to. They also had dead people that wouldn't stay dead. Not everyone, but sometimes people would come back after dying, and they would try to consume the living. The police and the Hunters Guild didn't know how to treat them because they didn't behave like any undead they were familiar with. So, the Empress provided information to the Kingdom of Vespucci, who decided to declare Crossroads as an exclusion zone. No one was allowed in nor out. A joint effort of both the Kingdom and the Empire to contain the contaminated civilians and corpses inside of Crossroads. Even all of these years later, there are still people living there, and there are still undead, but thankfully, no apexes. Yet. EZ0 officially doesn't exist, and Crossroads is declared an industrial ghost town, contaminated by various chemical weapons and unfit for human habitation, which I guess is technically true, although witnesses say there are still people living in EZ0. Tactics have advanced since the days of the Great War, and both the Kingdom and the Empire know that any contaminated corpses have to be destroyed completely to keep them from coming back. Although that doesn't stop contamination. Ashes still make their way into the local soil, which spread among the plants, which are consumed by herbivores and then by predators. This works the chemicals back into humans through the food chain. Dosages may be small, at least at first, but given enough time, it isn't able to be flushed out. Then Foresight 3 will build up in the body, creating more undead. Whether this happens quickly, across a few hours, or slowly, across years, depends on factors like the source of the Foresight 3 and how much is consumed at once. While the chemical weapon was designed to only affect dead cells, even healthy humans carry dead cells. So as Foresight 3 starts to affect your dead cells, you better hope that your living cells outnumber your dead cells, because when it doesn't, you'll see the signs. You will have memory loss, your blood vessels will darken, you will have stomach pain with no source, and you will lose hair. Then, as the confusion gets worse, your skin will start to rot and fall off as your body tries to make itself healthy. Your stomach pain will get worse as your liver is overwhelmed and begins to fail. Your temperature will drop as you grow hungry, constantly craving meat as you try to sustain the new biomass. You will find yourself wanting to hurt others, sometimes for petty reasons, and sometimes for no reason at all. Your confusion will get worse as your mind fades and your brain cells die. The pain will stop, but your condition will worsen as the black blood replaces all of your blood, and you will gradually lose control and awareness as you become a contaminated cadaver. However, no one knows where the point of complete loss of awareness occurs. People hope that you lose all of your awareness before you lose control of your body, but that is the downside of turning before you die. The assumption was that you may keep your awareness for anywhere from a few seconds to a few minutes after you lose control. However, recent MRIs from those who were alive when they turned may prove that they keep their awareness for weeks, months, or even years after they lose control of their bodies. forever prisoners in their own bodies, full of the hunger for the flesh of humanity, never satisfied, never resting, never dreaming, and never able to control yourself. A special kind of hell that even among the undead is considered a fate worse than death. So I implore you, do not go near Crossroads and do not tamper with Foresight 3. And as for Dr. Frances Foresight Stern, her final location is not known. It was known, however, that she never left the Seven Cities and that she was never captured by the Imperial government.